Welcome to the Math Ed Podcast. My name is Sam Otten from the University of Missouri, and today I'm very happy to be here with Jeremy Strayer, who you've actually heard on the podcast before. Jeremy's one of the contributors, but Jeremy, thanks so much for sitting here and talking about some of your work.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Jeremy is a faculty member in the Department of Mathematical Sciences at Middle Tennessee State University, and we're going to talk about some work that Jeremy has done that's going to be published very soon in the Statistics Education Research Journal. And the article there is entitled Toward a Fuller Implementation of Active Learning. So we're going to get into some active learning issues in stats education. That's going to be a lot of fun. But before that, Jeremy, I know you've been on the podcast. You've been summarizing some things with us. But also, I don't think we've ever actually kind of put your grad school on the map yet. And I always like to do that with guests. So where did you do your dissertation work and who did you work with?
Sure, yes. So I did my graduate work at The Ohio State University. Which is kind of a funny story. Actually, when I graduated, they had a linguist as the commencement speaker who talked about how preposterous it was that the is plays such a prominent role.
It's very consistent, though. Everybody that I ever hear always uses it, and the athletes are always very sure to have the in there.
That's right. It's funny. So I did my PhD work in mathematics education at Ohio State University, and my dissertation chair was Douglas Owens. And I was a part-time student, so I was working and teaching in the mathematics department at Mount Vernon Nazarene University while I was doing my work. So that meant I wasn't able to spend a lot of time on campus, so I wasn't involved in what Dr. Owens was doing, like with his projects particularly. Yeah. So my dissertation came out of my work as a teacher at the university level, and I was teaching a lot of intro to stats classes.
Oh, sure.
And at that time, we were using Blackboard. It might not even been called Blackboard, but it was some course management system. In one of the trainings for how to use that, I'll just call it Blackboard, they mentioned the classroom flip.
Oh, really?
And how we could use that online system for flipping the classroom, and they meant delivering lectures outside of classrooms so that inside you could open up time for students to engage the ideas and do active learning. I can't remember if they used the phrase active learning or not in the training. And so that I thought, this is something that sounds interesting to me. I'm thinking about using it in my course. So how about I pull that in as my dissertation time?
And that should have put you kind of on the cutting edge of at least calling it flip. Because I know there was maybe inverted classrooms, prior when you read a textbook for your homework and then come to class. But now, calling it flipped learning or flipped classroom, or in our project we call it flipped instruction. So you've carried that forward, but you were there at probably one of the first emergences of the word flip.
That's right. There were two articles only two places that I could find where at the same time, I forget the year, but it was in the same year. One citation called it the flipped classroom, and the other called it inverted classroom. Yeah. And so I may have used both terms in my dissertation. I remember in writing up subsequent work, reviewers were saying, "Hey, look, you have to choose. Or is it flipped classroom? Is it flipped learning? Is it is it this or is it that?" So, and I remember Sigrid Wagner was on my committee. She pushed back. She's like, "Really? Do we have to call it this inverted or flip? It's like there are student desks on the ceiling, or
that's why we don't call it something classroom." Like in our team with Xandra DeRaggio and stuff, we didn't want to call it flipped classroom because we feel like the classroom physical space is flipping or something. And we're like, it's not. This is a little inside baseball, and we're talking flip now, but that's fine. We didn't want to call it flipped learning because we're like the actual process of learning is not really changing, especially when people implement it with a lecture video and then practice problems. So we called it flipped instruction because we're just sort of like, you're changing something about how you're kind of executing your instruction, but the learning might be the same and the classroom space is not really changing. So that was our rationale for it.
I don't know. Instructional decisions.
But I know, I was just reviewing something recently and they called it flipped classroom. So I know I'm kind of, we're fighting maybe the momentum of people calling other things.
So I did my work there, and then taught for a few years at Mount Vernon Nazarene, then kind of moved on from there.
Yeah, great. Well, you had that experience teaching Intro to Stats, and so we're going to get into a little bit of the teaching of statistics, especially at the post-secondary level. So in this article in Surge, Toward a Fuller Implementation of Active Learning, there's a whole team here that was working on this article, and I was wondering if you could just start by telling us, how did this team get together?
Sure. So this team was already formed, actually, I think they started this project the year before, or maybe even a year and a half before, or 2 years before I came. So it was led by Ginger Rowell here at MTSU, and with colleague Lisa Green in the math department, and Scott McDaniel in the College of University Studies. Also Nancy McCormick, who was in the math department, was there. So that team had formed, and their goal was to say, okay, look, in stats education, we have all these recommendations. We've got the Gaze College report. We need to be using active learning in our classrooms, but it's hard. It's hard for instructors maybe who've never learned themselves in active learning environments. They don't maybe have a vision for what it looks like.
And instructors that don't have like teacher training, for example.
Exactly, right. And I think in particular, this team, at the beginning, they were thinking, lots of grad students teach intro to stat courses for non-majors. But also sometimes here, we were a normal college, and so we have different types of faculty members here. So there are some folks who are full professors here who have heavy teaching loads. There are others who are more research active who don't as much. But we have a whole gamut of types of faculty members who are teaching intro to stats here. So I think the team was brought together to say, all right, let's develop some materials. Let's find some really good activities that hit on the big ideas in Intro to Stats that already exist, that have been developed, that are out there in the literature. Let's take those. Let's develop some supporting teacher materials around them to really help these folks and support them in implementing active learning in Intro to Stat classrooms for non-majors.
Right.
Mainly.
Yeah. And what does active learning mean, like, to this team? Did you kind of have a shared understanding of what that is?
So this was the source of a lot of conversations on the team. I should add that once I came in, I believe Natasha Gierschenschlager, who's the second author on this article, she was a graduate student in the Math and Science Education PhD program here. We both came on at about the same time. Actually, Natasha may have beat me by a month or two. And she's now at Western Kentucky University, teaching there. So we would go round and round about this sometimes. And I think even the idea that active learning means people are up and physically active, right? Which that certainly is a part of some active learning activities. And one of our first modules includes an activity where it's the regression on the rebound activity, where you've got meter sticks and you're bouncing different types of balls and looking at the rebound height. So that's definitely people are physically active. But we really honed in on a shared understanding of, wait, where's the activity happening? It's the activity is happening here in your mind. You're actively thinking about concepts. When you're in the classroom and you're not just passively receiving a lecture from someone. So then our conversation started to steer towards, how do we think about what that environment is? How do we conceptualize it? And so we settled on the learning ecology conceptualization of the classroom. And we can get into that more later. But the tenets are the tasks students solve, classroom discourse, norms of participation, the tools that are used for learning, and the ways that the teacher orchestrates all of these aspects in the learning process. So we kind of honed in on that, and then realized that it's useful for us to focus in on the classroom discourse, the norms of participation, and the ways that the teacher are orchestrating those, because with these materials, we're providing the tasks that students solve, so there's no variation between our classrooms. And the tools used are kind of dictated, like using calculators or whatever. So we didn't kind of get into investigating those two aspects. But
so you have this group that's really committed to trying to increase the active learning in these stats courses. And in the article, you talk about the active learning materials that were used across the courses. And then you talk about kind of how that implementation happened. And you have some kind of reflections on how it went. But first, let me just have you describe the active learning materials. So give us a little insight into what kinds of tasks and what kinds of things were happening in these classes.
Right. So I already mentioned the regression on the rebound. That's a lot about collecting data and entering the data into calculators and then thinking about what the scatter plot means, creating the scatter plot, thinking about what it means, thinking about correlation coefficient. So a lot of the tasks in the MT-StatPow materials involve students like sharing their work on the board, so collecting some data in a small group and then putting the results on the board and then trying to make sense of it, look for patterns, reason together, think through it. There's another activity where it's a candy drop activity where you have a paper plate and have like little Smartie or sweet tart candies or something. And then you're dropping them and you have could be a 50-50 or a 75-25 like area portioned out on the plate. And then you keep track of the proportion. So it's a way of investigating binomial probability and the binomial distribution. And so folks, again, collect data, share it on the board, and then have conversations about it. We also do simulations for statistical inference activity where I like the helper hinderer activity. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but it involves flipping a coin. And then, again, collecting data as a small group, then compiling it all together as a whole class, sharing your results and having conversations about it. So that's kind of a theme in a lot of the activities.
And that can go to the norms, right? Like setting norms for how students should participate and be involved. If you kind of do a similar sort of thing over and over again, students can kind of realize, oh, we're supposed to participate in these ways. We're supposed to share ideas in these ways.
That's right.
Now you had the instructors, carrying out these activities and trying to implement active learning. So what did you see when you then looked at and analyzed the implementations? Like how did these play out and what did you notice?
Right. So we collected different types of data. So there were some like pre-test, post-test data where we wanted to answer the question, well, are students learning something? Right. So we definitely wanted to collect some data about that.
Make sure the learning part is in there.
Yes, that's right. But I was always pushing us to think about the implementation, like what's happening in the implementation. How are the instructors orchestrating these components of the learning ecology to like facilitate learning? What's this process look like? So that's where we were constantly having conversations about how to focus our observations to say something about that. So pretty early on, it really resonated with our group when we were observing folks teach with these materials to focus in on the types of conversations that were happening. So how were the students conversing about the statistics? And then, so what were the student-to-student conversations happening? Were they rich conversations, or were they, oh, what did you get for this as an answer for this problem? Or were they asking things like, oh, okay, well, so what does the correlation coefficient mean? And how do we know, so what types of, how rich were the conversations happening between the students? And then how rich were the conversations between the instructor and the students?
Right.
So we really use that lens of rich student-to-student and student-to-instructor conversations as a way to focus our observations as we were taking field notes.
And wanting to see statistical ideas that were being discussed. Like they're really talking about one of the key learning goals of the activity or something like that.
That's
and
correct.
They're interpreting it or they're having a conversation about it. Yeah. And then you looked at, too, a little bit of what were some of the teacher actions that they took, right? And sort of how did that play into the discussion? So what were some key moments that maybe the instructor did something or chose to do something or not do something and how that played out? A little bit of that too?
Right. So kind of what we did, at least what's described, the portion of the project that's described in this paper, we took field notes on 29 different classroom implementations with these materials. And so we looked at those field notes and categorize them according to the aspects of the learning ecology, in particular focusing in on classroom discourse, norms of participation, and the teacher orchestration. And then so we wanted to look for categories. And so Natasha and I made a big spreadsheet, right? And found some, and first of all, we just described, okay, from this piece of data, this is kind of a description of what we think is going on, and then we threw it to another team member to look at the data and look at our memo to see, look, does this fit with you? Right. And then so we had to negotiate some of those and modify. And then once we had those like negotiated descriptions of what was happening, then we started to look for broader categories. And so that's where we had one large category of active learning implementation that was either aligned with kind of reform-oriented documents and these ideas of what a good active learning implementation would look like. Either it's a limited alignment or a full alignment. And then within that overarching category, we had these subcategories of, the subcategory of classroom interactions, which had other dimensions: student contributions, teacher questioning, and student engagement. So the student contributions could range from superficial to substantive, teacher contributions from explanation to facilitation and so on, I guess.
Yeah. And the student engagement one, I think that's kind of important to clarify. You're sort of talking about the student engagement with the ideas of the lesson or of the activity. So it's not like behavioral engagement or something like that. It's like, are they just moving through what they're supposed to be doing, or are they taking ownership of the idea that we're developing together?
That's right.
That's the type of engagement that you're looking at.
Right. So with these materials, it's kind of tough because you want to provide enough structure in the materials that a teacher could pick them up and implement them in a lesson in a meaningful way, but you don't want it to be too structured so that it's a cookbook type situation, right? Yeah. So it was kind of like with the student engagement, it was, are the students using these materials as if it's a cookbook and we're just stepping through and filling in answers, or are they taking ownership of the ideas, like you said? Yeah.
So what were some of the themes that emerged when you looked at across those different, implementations? What stood out to you the most?
So as we were making sense of as we were going back and forth between the data and these categories, properties, and dimensional ranges, we kind of stepped back and said, okay, can we find like this big overarching idea that's explaining what's going on in these lessons? And we found that this idea of mathematical authority or statistical authority in the classroom had a lot of explanatory power, so that there were many instances where students were starting to want to take that ownership. And so in their small groups, they would start to engage with the ideas, and then the teacher maybe would want to kind of move the lesson forward or something. And so the teacher would kind of take control over the learning space, but the students hadn't necessarily had time to complete their thoughts. So there were these little, we called them sneaky student conversations, I think was a code. Where the students were really kind of wanting to take some of that authority back. I guess maybe it would be, you could kind of think of authority as like content authority and maybe pedagogical authority, or like what's happening in the structure of the learning environment. So it's like the students were wanting to say, hey, wait a minute, let me have some more space here. Let me carve out some time to talk. So there were lots of instances like that, or nice moments where the instructor would turn over the sense making authority to the students and give them an opportunity to reflect, talk to each other. Student would ask a question and the teacher would throw it back to the whole class to say, oh, okay, well, I don't know, what do you all think? Or during one of the regression on the rebound activities, students were dropping different kinds of balls, and so they were asking a question about, does it matter? And so the instructor said, oh, well, add that to your data collection, because it wasn't on the sheet to say which kind of ball you were using. So the teacher did a really nice job of letting them have a say and how the data was collected, and kind of shared that authority with them. But then as we saw the push and pull of giving authority, taking authority back, that really had a lot of explanatory power when we were looking at how these lessons were being implemented.
And so you feel like it rippled through some of the other dimensions as well? Like if the authority was shared or some leeway was given to students for authority, that also changed the kinds of student contributions that they had, or it seemed to, like you have that kind of sense.
Right.
Or it changed the teacher kind of could stay in the facilitator role as long as they still kind of kept pushing the authority back to the class.
Right, that's right.
But if they reclaimed the authority, then they started to tend toward the explanatory role for the teacher, or the student contributions maybe changed.
That's right. Yeah. So, and it was palpable in the air. Whenever there's an authority grab. I mean, that sounds like horrible a way to describe it, because it wasn't about that kind of situation. But once the instructor kind of would stop whatever the investigation was going, however the investigation was going, so that the students were doing the sense making, then if the students tried to push back, and then that was stopped again, then you could see the students revert back. So instead of the students having substantive contributions, they just started giving superficial. It's kind of like, oh, okay, well, what do you want me to say? So that we can fill in the blank and move on, because clearly you just want to move on. So yes, that claiming or giving of authority really changed where the folks were on these dimensional ranges for student and teacher contributions.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I know even as a teacher myself, it can be hard, because if the students start to develop a really interesting idea, or they have an insight that puts them right on the doorstep of the main learning goal that you have for the lesson, it's pretty enticing for the teacher to be like, you've brought me right to the doorstep. Let me like bring this home for you. Like,
yes.
You know, you've got us right here, and I'm going to take the reins, and I'm going to show you how cool it is what you just came up with, and how it like really unlocks everything we were trying to figure out. Mm-hmm. But maybe the students could have even taken that next step. Like maybe they could have gone through the door and not just up to the doorstep. Mm-hmm. But it's really hard because, you know, as an instructor, you have some insights into the content, you maybe enjoy the content, and so you maybe get really excited when students get that close to the key insight, or they have the key insight, and then you want to really take it and run, you know, take the baton from the students and run with it the next little part of the dash.
Yeah, and that's really something that came out in the instructor interviews, right? So I think something that our instructors were struggling with, and again, this is the first time that I know that one of the instructors had ever used active learning, and so he's really struggling with, okay, I'm the content authority and I'm the pedagogical authority, right?
Yeah.
So as the content authority, how do I draw on my content knowledge to know how to respond to students, you know? And so you could even hear him, I think in the paper we described, or we have some quotes where he's like puzzling through this and he's thinking, well, maybe I could anticipate what they're going to say, and then maybe I could have like different ways of responding to them based on how I think they might respond to this question, so that I can help them learn. So it's kind of interesting. Even we had a lot of teacher support materials in our materials, but it's like we had to draw the line of how big those teacher support materials were going to be, so we didn't
overwhelm them with everything.
Right, and we felt like, man, if we give them the think through the lesson protocol, that's just going to be completely overwhelming. But you can almost in that interview see him coming to, you know, that part of the think through lesson protocol of anticipating student responses, and so that was pretty neat to see as the materials were able to make a space for the instructor to reflect on their own practice and think about how they could take steps forward. In their implementation of active learning.
Yeah, and let's talk a little bit more about the instructors and their experiences, because they do come through somewhat in the article here, and you know, it is a shift for a lot of the instructors where they're giving up some control, they're literally giving up some authority, or ideally that's kind of the intention. And some of them are like, you know what, I'm pretty good at explaining these concepts, or I have a lot of confidence in how I've done this for a long time. I know, like one of the teachers says, like, you know, I'm actually pretty good at lecturing, which is probably true, you know, so then what did you get in terms of their kind of emotional experience of trying to move towards this active learning when they're leaving behind something that they have some confidence, some agency in?
Yeah, it was, you know, first of all, I like really commend all of the instructors who agreed to participate in the study, and, you know, we learned a lot from them, and it was really neat to see them take up different practices and make sense of different teaching practices as they were implementing active learning. But yeah, there were many times where we spoke and talked, and during interviews and just in the hallways of just the instructor saying, you know, I'm just kind of at a loss. I don't know. I know that I need to respond to help the student take a step forward, but I just don't know how to. So like you said, then the only thing left in the tank at that point when you're at a loss is to go ahead and give a nice explanation, which is, to be fair, sometimes, depending on the situation, sometimes what the student needs. It's just like how much of an explanation.
And you don't want to do the explanation just because that's the only thing you know how to do. You want to do the explanation because you've decided this is the appropriate thing to do right now. But I could have done something else. If you're just explaining because that's the only thing I can think of to do, that's not always the best.
Right. And this is an explanation for what purpose. Yeah. And that would help them guide how and make decisions about how they're explaining and when they'll stop explaining.
Right. Yeah. So I wanted to ask you about, you know, having worked with this team and really thought carefully about active learning in the stats courses, what have the implications been for MTSU, and what has this group kind of done after this analysis?
Yeah, this has been a really neat project. You know, it started in one or two of the team members' classrooms, right, where we would pilot some of the activities, observe it as a team, and then like scale up the support for it and so on. Scale it up so that there's 4 or 5 folks teaching with the materials, and then it was like every single section of this Intro to Stat course was using the MT StatPal materials. So we didn't just force it on everybody with no support. So we had the teacher materials, but then also the team, and I wasn't involved in this part of it, but the team created course communities so that everybody who was teaching this particular course came together either once or twice a week and discussed issues that they were having, shared victories and successes and struggles, I should say. And also, as is often the case actually with these types of situations, some of the instructors realize, oh, my content knowledge isn't as strong as I would like for it to be, so that I can respond in ways that are helpful for the students. So I know myself when I started teaching the pre-calculus with Marilyn Carlson's Pathways to Calculus materials, I was working with another faculty member here and who had been teaching for years and is brilliant algebraist. Both of us were thinking, oh my gosh, we're learning a lot of new pre-calculus, you know. So there's always that content. So there was space for folks to learn more about p-values or other intro to stats topics that are important and foundational. So that's something that's been really neat here at MTSU, where we've seen some communities of instructors form. Also, the team was able to get a little bit of extra funding to work with local community colleges. So we have these materials that have been taught at like multiple sites around Middle Tennessee. And so we didn't do as much research in those, but it was more about the implementation of instruction. So I think there have been a couple conference presentations that those faculty members at the community colleges were able to kind of come on board. And
if listeners are interested in the materials, or maybe they're teaching stats classes or intro to stats, is there somebody that they should contact, or what's the best route for them to take for that?
Right. Yeah. So I believe the link is still active, mtstatpal.com. And Scott McDaniel, he's the tech guy. He's more than that, but he on the team, he kind of heads up making sure that website is up to speed. And
And final thing about the article, I just wanted to ask if you see like a broader implication for the field of stats education, or maybe even beyond that.
Yeah.
Like what's the kind of bigger idea that you're left with having done this?
Yeah, so I think for the stats ed community, just continuing to dig into all of the nuanced aspects of implementing active learning. Like being able to dig into the specifics more and more in a way that's helpful for others I think it's really important for us to do. So I hope that like kind of more studies in stat ed would do that, or just in general.
Yeah.
But so the active learning is so that we move away from asking questions of, oh, here's an idea, did it work? To move away from those types of things and really digging into the specifics of what's happening in the classroom during the implementation and what can we say about different teacher actions and so on that help facilitate active learning. Yeah.
Jeremy Strayer is my guest from Middle Tennessee State University. And Jeremy, since you're very involved in the podcast, you know the question that's coming next.
Yes, I do.
So I'm curious what you've thought about for this question of, if you were not in math and stats education, what might you be doing instead?
Yeah. You gave me two different options when we spoke a little earlier, that I could have this like fanciful answer or a more serious answer. So I think I had both. I was actually going back and forth in my mind.
Sure.
So my fanciful answer is that I would be a rhythm guitarist for a band on tour.
You don't have to have all the pressure of the lead guitar, but you can be there on tour and
just kind of hang out, supporting role. Yeah, so I would love to, like Jason Isbell. I would be like rhythm guitars for Jason Isbell.
And you played guitar, right?
That's cool. Yeah. So I enjoy it. Picked it up in middle school, and so I love playing.
That's cool. I should have brought my guitar, actually, because I also started playing in middle school.
Nice.
Piano's my main instrument, but I still play guitar. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But what's your more realistic answer? Although that could be realistic. Nashville's right down the road.
That's right. Music City. More seriously, I love to think about theology. And so I could envision myself being either a faculty member in a school of theology, or even a pastor or a priest in some way. Kind of drawn to, it's interesting to me, how traditions shape us, different traditions, and each tradition has kind of their liturgy of their regular rhythms. And so sometimes, it's helpful for me to think in that way and make sense of what's happening in my own field. What's our liturgy, and what are the texts that really guide us? And so I could see myself, having a career in that kind of a
But a deep dive into the kind of intellectual history and stuff of the...
Absolutely, yeah. That's definitely the way I'm wired, yeah.
Well, thanks so much for speaking with us.
Thank you, Sam.